to mindlessly reading. I am a scribe, and this is Privet Drive after the rain. The street where things were mostly normal. Mr. Dursley liked to believe that streets were meant to remain as they were. A street, properly speaking, should begin at one end, continue in a straight and sensible line, and end somewhere else without incident. It should have houses that resembled one another just enough to avoid conversation, trees that shed their leaves at appropriate times, and drains that accepted rainwater without complaint. When these conditions were met, Mr. Dursley felt calm. Privet Drive met most of these requirements. On the morning in question, which was gray without being dramatic and wet without being memorable, Mr. Dursley stood at his front window and observed the weather with mild dissatisfaction. Rain had been falling for several days now, not heavily, but persistently, as though the sky had misplaced something and was still searching for it. The hedges were darker than usual. The pavement held a dull shine. Water moved slowly along the curb in a way that suggested it had nowhere in particular to go. Typical, Mr. Dursley muttered, although he was not sure what was typical about it. Behind him, the house continued its normal routines. A kettle boiled, a clock ticked. Mrs. Dursley adjusted the collar of her blouse and frowned faintly at the radio, which was reporting nothing of interest at all. Dudley made a sound that suggested dissatisfaction with his breakfast. All was in order, and yet, when Mr. Dursley reached for his briefcase, he noticed that the air near the floor felt cooler than it should have. Not cold exactly, just as if something below the house had recently remembered it existed. He dismissed the thought at once. Houses, like streets, were not meant to remember things. Outside, the rain continued. The drive was empty, except for a thin line of water traveling downhill with quiet determination. It carried with it a scrap of paper, no more than a folded corner, really, which bobbed and hesitated as it went. Mr. Dursley watched it for a moment longer than necessary, then turned away. He did not see where it went. Several streets away, and not on any map Mr. Dursley would have approved of, a child in a yellow raincoat stood at the edge of a road that no longer behaved like a road. Water covered most of its surface now, moving diagonally, ignoring the rules of direction. The child crouched low, watching something small and white ride the current. It was a paper boat. The boat was carefully folded, its creases pressed flat by hands that had taken their time. Wax had been rubbed along its edges, giving it a faint, cloudy sheen. It did not sink. It did not hesitate. It followed the water, as though the water had been waiting for it. The child laughed quietly, not because anything was funny, but because the sound felt right in the rain. The street signs nearby were dark. The traffic light at the intersection showed no color at all. Houses stood with their windows unlit, as if they had collectively agreed to look away for a while. The boat turned, straightened, and drifted onward. By the time Mr. Dursley reached his car, he had forgotten the scrap of paper entirely. He was thinking about drills, which were reliable, solid things that did exactly what they were told. The rain dotted the windshield with small, repetitive sounds. The engine started without hesitation. Everything behaved, and yet, as he drove, he noticed something odd at the corner of the street. There was a cat sitting on the low brick wall. This in itself was not remarkable. What troubled Mr. Dursley was the cat's posture. It sat very still, facing the road, its tail wrapped neatly around its feet. It was not watching the passing cars. It was watching the gutter. Mr. Dursley slowed, then scolded himself and continued on. Cats watched many things. That was their nature. There was no reason to assume intent. The cat did not move. Rainwater slid past its paws and into a storm drain further down the street, carrying with it leaves, grit, and the occasional fragment of paper. The cat blinked once slowly, as though counting. The drain had not always been there. At some point, the street had been repaired, resurfaced, adjusted. Someone had decided that water needed a place to go, and so the opening had been cut into the curb. It was dark inside, even during the day. The rain made a hollow sound as it fell in. If someone had been paying close attention, and no one was, they might have noticed that the sound was not entirely echo. There was a second quality to it, softer, irregular, as though the water were moving through spaces that had not been planned. No one listened long enough to tell. That evening, Mrs. Dursley remarked that the weather seemed determined. "It's been raining for days," she said, pouring tea. "You'd think it would get tired." "Rain doesn't get tired," Mr. Dursley replied automatically. Dudley pushed his cup away and demanded something else. The radio mentioned flooding in places that were not nearby, and therefore not concerning. Somewhere, a piano played a careful, repetitive tune that lingered on the airwaves longer than expected before fading. Mr. Dursley felt, briefly, that he had heard it before. He shook his head. There was no piano in their house. Later, as the house settled into sleep, the rain softened. It did not stop. It simply adjusted its rhythm, becoming quieter, more deliberate. The streetlights hummed faintly. The cat returned to the wall and resumed its watch. From beneath the street, water moved through narrow passages, past corners that curved too smoothly to have been carved by tools. The paper boat, still afloat, drifted onward, its edges holding firm. It passed through places where voices had once echoed, and through places where nothing had ever spoken at all. Above, in a house that believed itself entirely separate, a small boy slept on a doorstep, unaware of letters, water, or streets that did not stay where they belonged. His breathing was slow and even. One hand curled slightly, as if around the edge of something folded. The rain continued to fall, and the street, for now, remained mostly normal. Where the water learned the layout. The rain had been falling long enough that it no longer announced itself. It had moved past the stage of insistence and into something more methodical, as though it had accepted that it would be staying for a while and wished to do so efficiently. Water found the same paths again and again, deepening them not by force, but by familiarity. On Privet Drive, this resulted in small changes that were difficult to explain afterward. The gutter ran more quickly than before, though the slope of the street had not changed. Leaves gathered in places they had not gathered last year. The storm drained near the corner made a sound that was almost conversational if one stood near it long enough, though no one did. Most people, when passing it, unconsciously quickened their step. The cat remained. It had been there so long that the neighbors had begun to think of it as part of the street's design, like a lamppost or a hedge that had grown into a shape no one remembered trimming. It appeared in the mornings and evenings, sometimes in the same place, sometimes a few yards away, always facing the flow of water. When rain ran thicker, the cat's eyes narrowed slightly, as if focusing. No one attempted to move it. The paper boat traveled. It did not know it was a boat, nor that it had once belonged to hands that smelled faintly of wax and soap. It knew only the motion that carried it and the walls that guided it. Sometimes the walls were close. Sometimes they opened into spaces so wide that the sound of water lost itself before returning. In one such space, the water slowed. Here, debris collected. Leaves from unfamiliar trees, bits of wood smoothed to pale boat circled once, twice, then drifted onward, nudged by a current that seemed to come from below rather than above. The air in that place smelled of damp paper, old stone, and something sweet that had gone wrong. Mr. Dursley noticed the drains the following morning. He would not have said so if asked. He would have insisted that they had always been there, and that he had always been aware of them. But he found himself looking down more often as he walked, stepping carefully around puddles that seemed deeper than expected. At the bakery, the man behind the counter complained about flooding in the cellar. Water just keeps coming in, he said, like it knows where it's going. Mr. Dursley smiled thinly and paid for his bun. He did not like metaphors applied to infrastructure. Outside he paused. There was a scrap of folded paper caught against the curb, rocking gently. For a moment, just a moment, he thought it might be a boat. Then a car passed, and the water surged, and the paper vanished into the drain. Mr. Dursley felt an odd, fleeting disappointment. He told himself it was hunger. In a house not far away, a boy sat at a table folding paper with careful concentration. He folded and unfolded, adjusted corners, pressed creases flat with his thumb. Around him, the house was quiet in the way houses sometimes were when waiting for something to happen. The power was still out. A radio on the counter produced only a faint hiss. The clock above the sink had stopped, its hands fixed at a time that felt neither early nor late. Somewhere deeper in the house, water dripped at a steady pace, each drop landing in the same place. The boy finished the fold and held the result up to the dim light from the window. It was not quite right. He unfolded it and began again. On Privet Drive, Mrs. Dursley complained that the air smelled damp, even with the windows closed. "It's not proper," she said. "A house shouldn't smell like outside." Mr. Dursley agreed and adjusted the thermostat, though the temperature had not changed. Dudley complained of a draft near the floor. No one mentioned the faint sound that sometimes rose through the pipes late at night, like water moving where water should not be. The cat watched. Rainwater pooled briefly near the base of the Dursleys' front steps before draining away. Each time, it paused just long enough to reflect the house in a distorted way, stretching the windows, bending the doorframe. Then it was gone. The storm drain at the corner learned the street. It learned the rhythm of footsteps, the weight of cars, the way shadows lengthened in in the afternoon and retreated again. It learned which sounds meant nothing and which ones preceded change. When the rain slackened, it held water longer than necessary, as if reluctant to let it go. Something inside shifted, not forward or backward, but sideways. One evening, as Mr. Dursley returned home later than usual, he heard laughter. It was not loud. It did not echo. It sounded as though it belonged somewhere else and had drifted into the street by accident. He stopped walking and listened. The sound came again, thinner this time, accompanied by a faint rush of water. Mr. Dursley looked down the street. No one was there. The cat sat near the drain, its head tilted. "You're imagining things," he said aloud, and felt better for having said it. He walked on. Behind him, the laughter repeated itself, almost exactly the same. The paper boat reached another junction. Here, the water moved faster, pulling everything with it. The walls were smoother, the turns more precise. Faint markings lined the stone numbers, arrows, symbols that had been worn down until they meant nothing. The boat dipped, took on a little water, then righted itself. It floated. It always floated. The boy in the yellow raincoat appeared again, though no one could have said how he arrived there. He stood near the curb, watching the water move with quiet interest. Rain tapped softly on his hood. His boots made small splashes as he shifted his weight. He did not seem cold. A neighbor passing by might have wondered where his parents were. No neighbor did. The boy crouched and reached toward the water, then hesitated. Something moved below the surface. Not quickly, not threateningly, just enough to be noticed. The boy straightened and stepped back, satisfied for reasons he did not examine. That night, Mrs. Dursley dreamed of corridors. They were narrow and clean, lined with pipes that hummed gently. Water moved along the floor in shallow sheets, never touching her shoes. Doors appeared at regular intervals, each one identical, each one closed. She did not try to open them. Somewhere ahead, she heard a voice, repeating a phrase she could not quite make out. It was not urgent. It did not call her name. It simply continued, patient and unchanging. When she woke, she could not remember the words, only the rhythm. The cat left the wall shortly before dawn. It walked to the drain and looked down for a long time. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving behind damp silence. The streetlights flickered, then steadied. After a moment, the cat sat. Below, water continued to move, carrying with it paper, memory, and the impression of having been expected. The street waited, and somewhere between the places where stories usually begin and the places where they usually end, the layout continued to rearrange itself, slowly, carefully, as if ensuring that when attention finally slipped, there would be somewhere for it to go. In which familiar things begin to repeat themselves. By the third week of rain, though no one agreed later on whether it had truly been 3 weeks or merely felt that way, the weather stopped being discussed altogether. It had entered the background, like the hum of a refrigerator or the presence of a clock that no longer kept correct time, but was still glanced at out of habit. On Privet Drive, people adjusted without admitting that they were adjusting. Shoes were left nearer the door. Towels appeared at the base of steps. Conversations shortened, not out of fear, but because there seemed to be less to say. When something happened twice, it was remarked upon. When it happened a third time, it was accepted. The drains continued their quiet work. Mr. Dursley began to notice duplication. It was nothing dramatic. He would find himself checking his pockets twice for his keys, only to discover that he had already done so. He would read the same paragraph in the newspaper more than once, not because he had forgotten it, but because it seemed slightly different the second time through. Words rearranged themselves subtly, like furniture shifted by someone trying to be helpful. One morning, as he stepped out of the house, he heard himself clear his throat. A moment later, he cleared it again. The sound was identical. Mr. Dursley frowned, waited, then deliberately coughed. That was different enough to satisfy him. The street looked as it always had. The cat sat near the corner. Water moved along the curb in a narrow, shining line. Perfectly normal, he said, and felt steadier. In another house, the boy folded paper. He had made several boats now. They lined the edge of the table, each one similar, but not quite the same. Some were sharper at the prow. Some leaned slightly to one side. He tested each one briefly in a bowl of water, watching how they behaved, which ones drifted straight and which circled before settling. He did not know why he was doing this. He only knew that it felt necessary. The room smelled faintly of wax. Outside, rain tapped on the window in an irregular pattern that sometimes matched the sound of water moving through pipes beneath the floor. The boy selected one boat and folded the others back into flat sheets, stacking them neatly. This one, he thought, would do. At the corner of Privet Drive, the storm drain made a sound that resembled breathing. It was not loud. It did not draw attention to itself. If someone stood directly above it, they might mistake it for the wind moving through narrow spaces. But it was not the wind. Water flowed down, paused, then flowed again, as though waiting for a signal that never quite arrived. Something below shifted, then settled. Mrs. Dursley found herself humming. She did not recognize the tune at first. It came to her while she was washing dishes, her hands moving through warm water that reflected the overhead light in a way she found oddly soothing. The melody repeated itself after a few bars, looping back gently. She paused, trying to remember where she had heard it. It reminded her of something played on a piano, something careful and deliberate, something that did not rush. She stopped humming. A moment later, she began again, starting at exactly the same place. The paper boat entered a wider passage. Here, the water moved more slowly, spreading out across a shallow floor. The walls were marked with pale stains, where water had rested for long periods in the past. Objects drifted here for a while before being carried onward. Leaves, bits of wood, a single glove, turned inside out. The boat drifted alongside them, bumping gently, then separating. In this place, the sound of water layered over itself, echoing softly, repeating without urgency. If the boat had been capable of listening, it might have noticed that the echoes did not fade as they should have. They lingered. Mr. Dursley dreamed of maps. They were not maps of places he recognized. Instead, they showed streets looping back on themselves, drains leading to rooms, rooms opening opening into other streets. Some areas were shaded, others left blank. He traced a route with his finger, only to find that it returned him to the same point no matter which direction he chose. When he woke, his finger was still moving, drawing an invisible line on the sheet. He stopped it at once. The boy in the yellow raincoat stood near the curb again. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, barely noticeable unless one watched it closely. The boy watched the water instead. He held the paper boat carefully, cradled in both hands. He set it down. It floated. He smiled just a little. The boat moved away from him, following the shallow current toward the drain. It hesitated there, turning slightly, as if considering its options. The boy leaned forward, curious but calm. From the darkness below, something shifted. The boy felt a brief tightening in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. He straightened and took a step back, allowing the boat to continue on its own. It slipped into the drain and vanished. The boy stood for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, his boots leaving no lasting marks on the wet pavement. On Privet Drive, time adjusted itself. Mornings arrived with less distinction. Evenings lingered. Streetlights flickered on earlier than expected, or perhaps later. It was difficult to tell. The cat appeared in the same place at the same time each day, except when it did not. Once a neighbor waved at it. The cat did not respond. The storm drain learned new patterns. It learned repetition. Water entered, paused, entered again. Sounds echoed, then echoed again, matching themselves with uncanny precision. When something fell in paper, leaf, memory, it was not immediately carried away. It was allowed to remain for a while, to be noticed. Below, the passages rearranged themselves subtly, not changing shape so much as changing emphasis. Turns that had once led away now led back. Spaces that had been wide narrowed slightly, encouraging forward motion. Nothing was forced. Everything was invited. Mrs. Dursley found a letter on the mat. She did not recall hearing it arrive. It was damp around the edges, the paper slightly warped. Her name was written clearly, though the ink had bled just enough to blur the final letters. She opened it. Inside was a single sentence, typed neatly. Everything will be explained in time. She frowned, read it again, then folded the letter and set it aside. A moment later, she unfolded it and read it again, feeling a faint sense of reassurance she could not account for. The paper boat drifted onward. It passed through a place where the water fell in a thin sheet, creating a constant, whispering sound. Beyond that, the passage opened into a chamber where the ceiling was too high to see. The water pooled briefly here, slowing almost to stillness. Reflections formed on its surface, lights, shadows, shapes that suggested doors and windows where none existed. The boat rocked gently. From somewhere in the chamber, a sound repeated itself. Not a word, not a voice. A rhythm. Mr. Dursley stood at his window late one night, watching the street. The rain had stopped at last, leaving behind a silence that felt provisional. Water still moved along the gutter, but more slowly now, as if unsure what to do next. He saw movement near the drain. The cat sat, its posture unchanged, its gaze fixed downward. For a brief, inexplicable moment, Mr. Dursley thought he saw something else reflected in the wet pavement. Another street, another house, overlapping with his own. He blinked. The reflection was gone. Mr. Dursley drew the curtains. Below the street, the water continued to move. It carried with it the sound of footsteps that had passed overhead. The echo of a tune hummed more than once. The memory of folded paper pressed flat and folded again. The passages repeated themselves gently, offering the same turns, the same choices, until choice itself began to feel unnecessary. Above, the street settled into sleep. And somewhere between the drain and the door, between the sound of water and the sound of breath, the story continued not forward, but inward, circling quietly, waiting for attention to loosen its grip. Where causes loosen and effects remain. After a while, it became difficult to say what had started what. The rain had stopped, certainly. That much was observable. The sky lightened, clouds thinning into something pale and undecided. And yet, water still moved through the street, as if the rain were merely pausing between thoughts. The gutter on Privet Drive continued its quiet work, carrying small, reflective streams toward the drain that had learned so much already. People noticed, and then stopped noticing. This was not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening did not insist on being named. Mr. Dursley woke one morning, convinced that it was Tuesday. He went through his routine accordingly. He selected his most boring tie, the one that never drew comment. He ate his breakfast at the same pace he always had. He glanced at the calendar on the kitchen wall and felt a mild irritation at the fact that it did not agree with him. The calendar claimed was Thursday. Mr. Dursley considered this for a moment, then adjusted the calendar forward 2 days. The relief was immediate. Mrs. Dursley found that the letter had returned. She was certain she had thrown it away. She remembered folding it carefully, placing it in the bin, pushing it down beneath other, more solid things. And yet there it was again, resting on the sideboard, its edges still damp, its single sentence unchanged. Everything will be explained in time. She touched the paper. It was cool. This time, she did not read it aloud. She folded it and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened. The drawer slid shut with a soft, satisfied sound. The explanation, she thought, could wait. Below the street, water moved through passages that no longer led anywhere new. It did not mind. The boat drifted in wide, slow circles now, as though the current had decided that arrival was less important than continuation. The wax along its edges had softened, but it still held. It always held. Other things floated nearby. Fragments of paper, pale and pulped. Leaves worn thin as cloth. An object that might once have been a glove, or might always have been something else. The water hummed. It hummed the same way each time. The boy did not appear again. Or perhaps he did, but not in a way that required recognition. A flash of yellow reflected briefly in a window. A footprint filled with water and then disappeared. A sense lingering near the curb that someone had recently been there and was satisfied. No one asked questions. On Privet Drive, conversations shortened further. People spoke, but their sentences tended to circle back to where they had begun. Complaints about dampness led naturally to comments about the weather, which led naturally back to dampness. When someone repeated themselves, it went unnoticed. When someone repeated themselves again, it felt appropriate. The cat remained. Sometimes it sat. Sometimes it stood. Once it lay down near the drain, curling its body neatly, as though settling in for a long wait. Its eyes never closed. Mr. Dursley began to experience a curious sensation while walking. He would step forward and feel, briefly, as though he had already taken that step. Not in a troubling way. More like recognition. The pavement under his shoes felt familiar, even when he had not been there before. The distance between his house and the corner seemed both shorter and longer than he remembered. He adjusted his pace. The sensation passed. It always did. The drain made room. It did not expand. It did not deepen. It simply accommodated. When water arrived, it accepted it. When water paused, it held it. When something fell in, it did not hurry it along. From time to time, a sound rose from below, a repetition of something that had once been said above. A word without urgency, a laugh without humor, a tune without a beginning. These sounds did not travel far. They did not need to. Mrs. Dursley dreamed again of corridors. This time she walked them. Her footsteps made no sound. The doors along the walls were still closed, but she passed them without curiosity. At the end of the corridor, she found a drain set neatly into the floor. Water flowed into it in a thin, steady line. She watched it for a long time. When she woke, she felt rested. The paper boat rocked gently. The water here was almost still, disturbed only by small ripples that spread and faded without cause. Reflections layered themselves on the surface, lights, shapes, the suggestion of a sky where there was no sky. The boat turned once, then again. It floated on the street above. The house lights dimmed and brightened, as if testing their range. The clock in the Dursleys' kitchen resumed ticking, though it still did not keep correct time. Somewhere nearby, a piano played a careful phrase and stopped. No one commented. Mr. Dursley stood at the front door one evening, keys in hand, uncertain whether he had just arrived or was about to leave. He waited. The uncertainty passed, leaving behind a pleasant emptiness. He went inside. Below, the passages no longer rearranged themselves. They had found a pattern they liked. Water moved. Sounds repeated. Objects drifted, then drifted again. Nothing progressed. Nothing ended. The system was stable. The cat blinked. Once, then it resumed watching. Above and below, the same quiet rhythm continued. Water moving, stopping, moving again. Thoughts beginning, looping, settling. Streets holding their shape, while allowing just enough distortion to make holding unnecessary. The story did not advance. It did not conclude. It simply continued, evenly and without insistence, like typing that never quite reaches the end of the page. Where names matter less than motion. By now, it was no longer useful to count days. Morning and evening still occurred, of course, but they no longer carried the sense of progression they once had. Light arrived, light faded, and in between, there was a stretch of time that behaved politely, but without ambition. People moved through it as they always had, only more slowly, and with less expectation of arrival. On Privet Drive, the houses remained in their places. They were very good at that. Mr. Dursley still went to work. He put on his tie. He picked up his briefcase. He stepped outside and walked to his car. Each action followed the next in the correct order, but the order itself had begun to feel optional. Sometimes, as he reached the end of the drive, he felt a gentle uncertainty about whether he had already done so. When this happened, he paused. Pausing helped. The uncertainty drifted away, leaving behind only the action itself, which resumed without complaint. Mrs. Dursley stopped checking the drawer. The letter was there when it needed to be and gone when it did not. She accepted this without thought. The sentence inside it no longer required reading. She knew it by shape rather than by meaning. Everything will be explained in time. Time, she felt, was behaving well enough. The cat became harder to notice. This was not because it left, but because it belonged. It fit the street so precisely now that the eye slid past it without comment. Even when it moved, even when it turned its head, the motion felt like part of the street's own adjustment. The drain continued to accept water. The water continued to arrive. Below, the paper boat drifted. It had been drifting for some time. It no longer passed through new places, nor did it need to. The passages it traveled repeated themselves with slight variations, an echo arriving a moment later than before, a reflection bending at a different angle. The boat did not mind. It turned, it rocked, it floated. Occasionally, something like a voice appeared. Not words exactly, more like the shape of speech, the intention without the effort. The sound rose, repeated itself once, then faded back into the hum. If the boat had ears, it might have recognized the cadence. If it had memory, it might have felt reassured. Above, a neighbor began watering their lawn. This was unusual, given the recent rain, but it felt correct. The hose produced a steady arc of water that darkened the grass in a way that was satisfying to watch. Excess water ran toward the curb, joined the gutter, and continued on. The neighbor watched it go, then adjusted the hose slightly and watched again. Mr. Dursley found himself standing at the corner one afternoon. He did not recall walking there. The drain sat quietly at his feet. The street reflected the pale sky. For a moment, he felt the faint impression that something was supposed to happen here. He waited. Nothing happened. This was acceptable. He turned and walked back the way he had come, noticing only afterward that his footsteps sounded the same on the return as they had on the approach. The boy in the yellow raincoat did not return. Or perhaps he did, but not as a boy. A ripple in the water carried a brief flash of color. A folded shape appeared for an instant near the curb, then flattened and disappeared. The sense of careful hands lingered without hands to belong to. No one felt alarm. Below, the water deepened slightly. Not in volume, but in tone. The hum became rounder, fuller, as if the space itself were content. Reflections smoothed out. Edges softened. The boat's outline blurred just a little, though it remained intact. It floated. It had always floated. Mrs. Dursley sat at the kitchen table and stared at the clock. The second hand moved. Then it moved again. The movement repeated itself so precisely that it felt less like progress and more like demonstration. She watched for a while, then stopped watching, though her eyes remained open. When she stood up, she could not have said how long she had been sitting. She felt calm. The cat closed its eyes. This happened so gradually that no one saw the moment itself. The posture remained the same. The body remained still. Only the eyes shifted from watching to remembering how watching worked. The drain made its familiar sound. The paper boat completed another slow circuit. Water brushed its sides. Wax held. The motion repeated itself exactly, then nearly exactly, then exactly again. There was no urgency to change. The space was sufficient. The movement was sufficient. On Privet Drive, lights glowed behind curtains. People prepared for sleep in their individual ways, each one repeating habits learned long ago. Doors were locked. Cups were rinsed. Thoughts were allowed to trail off without conclusion. Outside, the street rested. Below, above, between, nothing required attention. The story did not need to resolve itself. It did not need to explain. It did not need to arrive anywhere new. It only needed to continue, and it did, where the page continues without asking. There was no clear moment when things became quiet. They had been quiet for some time already. What changed was not the sound, but the listener's relationship to it. Water still moved, light still shifted, objects still occupied space, but none of it required tracking. None of it asked to be followed from one moment to the next. Privet Drive, the street existed. That was enough. Mr. Dursley slept. His breathing settled into a steady pattern that did not need adjustment. Thoughts arrived less frequently now, and when they did not stay. They passed through in the same way the water passed through the gutter, briefly visible, then gone. In one drifting moment, he thought of a street. In another, he thought of paper. Neither thought connected to the next. Mrs. Dursley slept as well. In her sleep, she stood in a familiar room that did not require her to remember its purpose. The drawer was open. The letter was inside. She did not read it. She knew what it would say, and knowing was sufficient. The room dimmed slightly. Then it dimmed again. The cat remained near the drain. Or perhaps the drain remained near the cat. The distinction no longer mattered. Eyes closed, body still. The cat rested in a posture that suggested patience without expectation. It did not dream of mice or movement. It dreamed, if it dreamed at all, of stillness repeating itself correctly. Below the street, water flowed in the way it always had. It followed paths that no longer felt like paths. It passed corners that no longer felt like turns. The passages held their shape without insisting on direction. The paper boat drifted. It drifted in a wide, even motion that neither sped up nor slowed down. Wax softened further, but the folds remained. They always remained. The boat rocked. Then it rocked again. A sound repeated. It might once have been a word. It might once have been laughter. It might once have been the careful tapping of keys. Now it was simply rhythm, spacing itself evenly, allowing silence between each occurrence. The silence was not empty. It was full of permission. Above, a light went out. Then another. Then another. Each darkness fit neatly into place, leaving no gaps. Time passed, or did not. The clock hand moved, or demonstrated movement. The distinction no longer mattered. The second hand reached the same place again and again, always arriving exactly when expected. The drain accepted what arrived. Water arrived. Memory arrived. Nothing stayed long enough to require sorting. The paper boat completed another circuit. And another. If one were to count, the counting would soon lose its place. If one were to follow closely, the following would soften into watching, and the watching into something less precise. The boat floated. It had always floated. The street rested. The houses rested. The space between things rested. Somewhere not above, not below, not entirely anywhere, a sentence began and did not finish. It continued, in a way, did not require punctuation. Words appeared, spaced evenly, and then repeated themselves gently, not because they were important, but because repetition was soothing. The typing did not hurry. The typing did not stop. It simply continued, evenly, quietly, as if there were always more page left than anyone needed to see. And after a while, not abruptly, not decisively, attention loosened. The story did not end. It remained.